My parents paid for my brother's college, and I was told that girls didn't need an education, just find a husband and be quiet. My name is Clara, and I grew up in a small town in Indiana where those words sounded like a sentence. I was 17 when I realized I couldn't take their love, which suffocated me, and their injustice, which cut like a knife. I ran away from home with $43 in my pocket, all I had saved from selling old books and working odd jobs for neighbors. 10 years later, I became a cardiologist and my father ended up on my operating table, but back then, on that cold night, I was just running, not knowing where I was going. It all started with my brother, Tom. He was 2 years younger, but for his parents he was a golden boy, their pride, their future. I remember my mom stroking him on the head when he brought home C's from school, and my dad bragging to the neighbors that Tom would become an engineer. No one was interested in my A's. I would bring report cards, and my mom would just grumble that I read too much, that it was not a woman's business. When I was 16, I said I wanted to go to college, study medicine, save people. My dad laughed, his voice echoing through the kitchen, "Girls don't cut people, Clara, they sew shirts and make soup." Mom nodded, adding, "I should be thinking about the wedding, not books." When Tom turned 18, they sold the old truck and took out a loan to pay for his education at a state university. I sat at the table, listening to them plan his future dorm, textbooks, even pocket money. I asked, "What about me? I'm 17, I could go with him, study, work." My father looked at me, his eyes as cold as the winter wind, and said that my dreams were stupid, that I should wait for a man to take care of me. My mom added that a college for girls was a waste of money, that I was smart enough already. I clenched my fists under the table, feeling the anger choking me, but they didn't notice. Their world revolved around Tom, and I was just a shadow. I could have resigned myself like so many others. Many girls in our town did, graduate from school, get married, have children, forget themselves. But I couldn't. Every time I saw Tom packing his things for college, my mom making him sandwiches and my dad slapping him on the shoulder, I felt something inside me crack. I worked at the library for a pittance, cleaned my neighbors' houses, saved every coin I had, but it wasn't enough. I asked them again, all I wanted was a chance. My father yelled that I was ungrateful, that they had given me shelter and food, and I dared to ask for more. My mom cried, saying that I was disgracing the family with my stupid ideas. That night I realized that they would not change. And I couldn't stay. I left at night. I remember packing my things, jeans, 2 t-shirts, an old sweater, an anatomy book I bought for $1 at a sale. I had $43 in my pocket, my treasures, earned through sweat and humiliation. I left a note on the kitchen table, a short one, "No tears, I'm leaving. Don't look for me." I knew they wouldn't look. They didn't care as long as Tom was home, their golden boy. I walked out into the darkness, the cold biting my feet through my thin sneakers, but I kept going. The bus to Chicago cost $20, and I got on, holding my bag in my lap, watching the city disappear outside the window. I had $23 left and no plan, but I was free. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew why. Every step I took away from that house was a rebellion against their words, against their blindness, against the world they had imposed on me. I imagined how my mom would find the note and sigh, how my dad would mutter that I would come back when I was hungry. But I didn't come back. I sat in that bus, listening to the hum of the engine, and promised myself that I would prove them wrong. I would become someone, with or without education, with their help or against their will. And I didn't know that 10 years later, fate would challenge me in a way I hadn't expected. When I ran away from home with $43, I had no plan, no roof over my head, only anger and stubbornness that drove me forward. That bus to Chicago was my first step into the darkness, where I had to survive or disappear. 17 years old, $23 after the ticket, an old bag with a hole in it, that's all I had. But I didn't cry, didn't call home, didn't ask for forgiveness. I knew that if I stopped, their words "girls don't need education" would catch up with me and crush me. So I walked, fell, got up, and every day was a battle to prove that I was worth more than they thought. Chicago greeted me with cold and noise. I got off the bus at a station that smelled like gasoline and cheap food and stood there holding my bag, not knowing where to go. I spent the first night there, on a bench, wrapped in a sweater, listening to homeless people warming their hands over a barrel of fire. I had $23, and I bought a hamburger for two, the first hot piece I'd had in a day. I chewed slowly, feeling the hunger recede, and thought, this is all I have. I could have spent the rest on a motel night, but I decided to save money. I needed a plan, not just warmth for one night. The next day, I found a shelter, dirty, overcrowded, smelling of sweat and fear. They gave you a bed and a bowl of soup if you didn't ask for too much. I signed in as Clara Wilson, a name I made up so no one would find me. The women around me whispered about their children, their husbands who beat them, and I listened, keeping my story to myself. I was not a victim like them, but I felt the same coldness in my bones. At the shelter, I learned about part-time jobs, washing dishes in a diner for $5 a day. My hands were shaking with fatigue, my back ached from standing, but I pocketed every dollar, knowing that this was my path. I dreamed of education, but reality hit harder. With $43, I could not buy textbooks or pay for courses. So I worked, washing plates, cleaning stores, carrying boxes in warehouses. Every cent went into a hiding place, an old coffee can that I kept under my bed in the shelter. I slept little, ate even less, but did not give up. One day I saw an announcement in the library, free evening classes for school dropouts. I went there, holding my anatomy under my arm, and sat in the back row, listening to the teacher talk about fractions and history. It was my first taste of learning, and I felt something inside me come alive. A year later, I saved enough to rent a corner in an old apartment with 3 other girls. We shared one bathroom and slept on mattresses, but it was my home. I got a job as a waitress in a cafe, tips were better than washing dishes, and I could eavesdrop on the conversations of students at the tables. They talked about college, about exams, about the future, and I hated them for having what I dreamed of. But I didn't stop. I went to those free classes, graduated from high school as an external student, and received a diploma with frayed edges. At 19, I stood with it in my hands and thought, this is just the beginning. Money for college seemed out of reach, but I found a loophole. I found out about scholarships for the poor, for those who were struggling on their own. I wrote my applications at night, sitting by a lamp that buzzed like an insect. My hands trembled as I sent them off dozens of letters, dozens of rejections. But one day, a letter came from a small college in Illinois, a full scholarship if I passed the entrance exam. I handed it in, sitting in a cold hall, with my heart pounding, and when I saw, accepted, I cried for the first time in years. Not with joy, but with relief, I had done it myself. College was hell and heaven at the same time. I lived in a dorm, ate cheap noodles, and studied until dawn. Medicine became my life. I analyzed heart diagrams, learned the names of bones, and breathed the smell of textbooks. I didn't think about my parents, about Tom, about that house. They were the past, and I was building the future. At 23, I entered medical school, a scholarship, part-time jobs, loans that strangled me, but I didn't stop. At 27, I became a cardiologist, exhausted but alive. I held my diploma and thought, I have proved myself. But I did not know that fate was preparing a test for me. Will I ever return to them? Do I need their apologies? I went forward, keeping the $43 in my memory as a reminder of where I started. And I didn't realize that 10 years later everything would come back to where I ran away from. 10 years after running away from home, I became a cardiologist, holding not $43, but people's lives in my hands. I didn't just survive, I carved out a place for myself in a world my parents thought was not for me. I worked in a Chicago hospital where monitors were humming, disinfectant smelled, and every day was a battle against time and death. My hands knew hearts, how they beat, how they stop, how to bring them back to life. But the scars from those words, "Girls don't need education," remained in me, deep and silent, like cracks in old glass. I didn't think about my parents, about Tom, about that house, but they lived in me like a shadow that I couldn't erase. My career was my rebellion. I graduated from medical school with a strangling debt, but with a head full of knowledge. The first years in the hospital were hell, nights without sleep, screaming in the intensive care unit, tears of relatives clinging to my gown. But I loved it. Every patient I saved was proof that I was not just a girl who had to find a husband, I was a force that held death by the throat. I specialized in heart surgery, complex, risky, where one mistake could end everything. My colleagues respected me, even though I did not tell them about my past. They saw me as a cold-blooded professional, but they did not know that every stitch on my heart was my cry against those who rejected me. I was not looking for fame, but it came. When I was 25, I saved a man with a ruptured aorta 3 hours in the operating room, blood on my gloves, sweat on my forehead. The doctors whispered about it for weeks, but I just went home and fell asleep holding my cold coffee. When I was 26, I was invited to a conference. I stood in front of a crowd in a white coat, talking about a technique I had perfected, and saw people nodding. I wasn't bragging, but I felt proud, not the kind of pride that needs applause, but a quiet one that warms you from the inside. I had become one of the best in my field, and this was my shield from the past. But the scars were not healing. I lived alone in a small apartment, a sofa, a table, a shelf with medical books. I did not start a family, did not look for a husband, as my mother wanted. There were men in my life, short romances that faded away when I chose work over candlelit dinners. I didn't trust people close to me, maybe because the first ones I was supposed to trust pushed me away. I didn't call home, write, or check on them. Tom must have graduated from college and become an engineer, just like my dad had promised. I didn't care. They were part of the world I had left, and I didn't look back. Sometimes I thought about them at night when I couldn't sleep. I would imagine my mom cooking dinner, my dad sitting in his armchair, muttering about the weather. Did they remember me? Did they feel sorry for me? I chased these thoughts away, but they kept coming back like uninvited guests. I hated them for what they had done, but somewhere deep down, so deep that I didn't recognize it, I wanted them to see me now. Not for reconciliation, not for tears, but for them to feel how wrong they were. I kept it inside me, locking it in a box with the $43 in the drawer, my reminder of where I started. My job became my home. I knew every sound in the hospital, the beeping of monitors, the clatter of gurneys, the whispering of nurses. I was where I was needed, where I could make a difference. Once I saved a girl, 16 years old, a weak heart, parents in tears. I operated for 4 hours, and when she opened her eyes, her mother hugged me, thanking me through her sobs. I smiled, but inside I thought, where were my parents when I was like her? I didn't let it break me, I moved on, to the next patient, to the next battle. I did not know that fate was preparing a meeting for me that I did not expect. Will I ever come back to them? Would I want to see them? I didn't look for answers because I thought the past was dead. But it was not dead, it was waiting, hiding around the corner, ready to strike at the most unexpected moment. I lived my life holding hearts in my hands, and I did not realize that soon I would have to hold the heart of the man who broke me. That night I went to bed feeling strangely uneasy, but I put it down to fatigue. I didn't know that the next call would change everything. For 10 years I kept the past behind closed doors, but one day it burst into my operating room with sirens blaring. It was night, I had just finished my shift, 12 hours, 3 surgeries, my hands were shaking with fatigue. I was sitting in the resident's room, holding a cold coffee, when the phone rang. The nurse said that they were bringing an emergency patient, a heart attack, a man, 62 years old, critical condition. I nodded, pulled on a robe, and ran to the waiting room. I didn't know it was my father, but something in me clenched when I heard his name, James Wilson. A coincidence, I thought, but my legs were already carrying me to the gurney. He was brought in chaos, with paramedics screaming about his falling blood pressure and monitors beeping like crazy. I ran up, looked at him, and the world froze. He was lying there, pale, with his eyes closed, his gray hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. I knew his face, the same rough features, the same nose that I saw in the mirror every day. But I didn't stop, I didn't give myself time to think. I shouted to the team to prepare the operating room, checked his pulse, weak, barely perceptible. My hands moved automatically, but everything was burning inside. It was him. My dad. The man who said that I was not worthy of education, that I should find a husband and be quiet. And now his life was in my hands. I took him to the operating room, feeling the time stretching like rubber. The nurses were fussing, the anesthesiologist was preparing the tubes, and I stood over him, looking at his chest, which was barely rising. I did not feel pity, not then. I felt anger, cold and sharp as the scalpel I had taken. For 10 years I hadn't seen him, hadn't heard his voice, didn't know if he was alive. And here he is, powerless, on my table, and I am the only one who can save him. I could have stopped and handed him over to someone else, but I didn't. I turned on my mind, turned off my heart, and started. The surgery was hell. His arteries were clogged, his heart was beating irregularly, every minute was like dancing on the edge. I was cutting, inserting stents, watching the monitor where the lines were jumping like crazy. My hands didn't tremble, I didn't let them. But inside I was screaming. I remembered how he laughed at my dreams, how my mom nodded, how they paid for Tom, and I was pushed out into the middle of nowhere. I saw the $43 in my pocket, the nights in the shelter, the hours over books as I collapsed from exhaustion. And now I was holding his heart, literally holding it, squeezing it in my palms to bring it back to rhythm. The team worked in silence, knowing that I don't like unnecessary words. But I could feel their eyes on me, they could see how I was struggling, how I was not giving up. 3 hours passed like a moment, and when I was done, his heart rate stabilized. I stepped back, took off my gloves, feeling the blood pounding in my temples. He was alive. I had saved him. But I didn't feel relieved, I felt empty. I stood there looking at him and thought, why? Why did I do it? Because I could. Because I had to. Or because somewhere deep down I was still that girl who wanted him to see her. He was transferred to the intensive care unit, and I followed him, keeping my distance. I stood by the glass, watching him lie there with tubes in his nose, the monitors beeping softly. I didn't know if he recognized me, if he remembered me. 10 years is a long time, and I have changed. My hair was shorter, my face harder, my eyes colder. But I was his daughter, even if I didn't want to admit it. I went back to the residence room, sat down, closed my eyes, and felt everything in me tremble. I didn't cry, I didn't allow myself to. But I was thinking, what's next? He will wake up, and then what? I didn't know that my mom had called the hospital looking for him. I didn't know that she had called my name, begging them to find his daughter, who had run away once. I didn't know that they brought him here by accident because it was the closest hospital. But I knew he was alive because of me, and it was like a knife in the ribs. Would he recognize me? Would he realize what I had become? I sat there holding my cold coffee and felt the past coming closer, like a shadow I thought I had left behind. And I was not prepared for what would happen when he opened his eyes. He woke up an hour after the surgery. I stood at his bedside, checking the monitors, when his eyes slowly opened. They were dull, blurred by the medication, but still the same eyes that had looked at me with contempt when I asked for a chance at education. I didn't say anything, just watched the numbers. My pulse was steady, my blood pressure was normal. My hands moved automatically, adjusting the drip, but inside I was burning. He was here, alive, because of me, and I didn't know whether I wanted to scream at him or just walk away. He turned his head, slowly, as if every movement cost him strength. I felt his gaze on me, at first confused, then sharp as a knife. I stood there in my bathrobe, with my name tag on my chest, Clara Wilson, cardiologist. He stared at it, his eyebrows furrowed, and I saw everything in him freeze. His lips moved, softly, hoarsely, and I heard that whisper, "I think I know you." My insides clenched, but I didn't flinch. I looked at him, directly into his eyes, and nodded, briefly, without words. I didn't know what he remembered, but I could see the puzzle forming in his head. He tried to get up, but I put my hand on his shoulder, holding him back. His skin was cold, sticky with sweat, and I could feel his body shaking. He kept his eyes on my badge, as if that little piece of plastic was a ghost from the past. I could see his mind struggling, with the pain, with the medication, with the truth that was in front of him. He knew me, not the cardiologist, but Clara, the girl who ran away from home with $43, whom he had pushed away. But I didn't give him time to talk. I stepped back, checked the monitor, and told the nurse that he was stable. My voice was cold as steel, and I was proud of it. I could have stayed, waited for him to speak, to apologize, or blame, or cry. But I didn't want to. I left the room, feeling his eyes drilling into my back, and went to the residence room. There I sat down, closed my eyes, and felt everything in me tremble. He recognized me, I could see it in his eyes, in that whisper. But what did it mean? Did he realize who I had become? Did he feel any shame for what he had done? I didn't know, and part of me hated myself for caring. An hour later, my mom came home. I heard her voice in the hallway, high and trembling, the same one that used to grumble about my dreams. She was crying, asking the nurses about James, and I froze when I heard her say my name. "Clara, our daughter, she's here somewhere, she ran away, but maybe she knows." I hid behind the door, holding my breath, and listened to the nurse reassure her, saying that the doctor had done everything. My mom didn't know I was the doctor. She did not see me, and I did not come out to her. I couldn't not when the anger and pain of 10 years had been suffocating me. I returned to his room later, after she had left. He was lying there, looking at the ceiling, his hands trembling on the sheet. I stood in the doorway, looking at him, and saw him turn his head toward me. His eyes were wet, but I didn't know if it was from pain or tears. He tried to say something, but I raised my hand to stop him. I didn't want words, no apologies, no explanations. I had saved him, and that was all I had to do. I turned and walked away, feeling his gaze clinging to me, but I didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at home, holding an old can of $43, and thought, what now? He knew who I was, he knew that I had become what he didn't let me be. But did it change anything? Did I want him to beg or just forget him again? I had saved his life, but not his heart, not in the sense that I could have. And as I looked at my reflection in the dark window, I asked myself, what will I do with this truth? Will I go to him again, or will I leave him in silence? That night I went home, leaving the hospital behind. I sat on the couch, holding the old jar with those $43, and felt everything in me tremble. He knew who I was, I could see it in his eyes, in that faint whisper. But I didn't know what he was feeling, shame, shock, or just emptiness. And I didn't want to know. I imagined him lying there in the intensive care unit, with tubes and monitors, thinking about the girl who ran away and came back as the doctor who saved him. Did he realize that he was wrong? Did he feel even a drop of the pain that I had been carrying for 10 years? I did not ask, because the answer would not have changed anything. Mom came again, I found out from the nurse the next day. She was crying in the hallway, holding his hand, when he was transferred to a regular ward. She asked about me, said I was somewhere in Chicago, that maybe I would hear about him and come. I stood around the corner, listening to her voice, and felt anger and regret fighting inside me. She didn't know that I was there, that I was holding his heart in my hands, that I had become what they didn't let me be. I could have come out to her, thrown the truth in her face, but I didn't. I went back to my work, to the next patient, to the life I had built without them. I did not go to see him again. He was recovering. I checked his card through my colleagues, keeping my distance. His condition improved, his blood pressure stabilized, and his heart was beating steadily. I had done my job, and that was enough. But I could see his eyes in my head, those wet, confused eyes looking at my name tag. And I asked myself, what did he want to say? Would he apologize, would he blame me, or would he just keep quiet? I didn't give him a chance, and that was my triumph, not loud, not sweet, but quiet as a step in the dark. A week later, he was discharged. I learned from the nurse that he went home with his mother, that he walked slowly but held on. I stood in the residence room, listening to this, and felt something in me let go. He left, taking with him the past that I had been holding in my fist for 10 years. I didn't call, write, or look for them. I imagined them sitting in that old house in Indiana, my mom cooking dinner, him grumbling about the weather. Did they talk about me? Did he tell her that I saved him? I didn't know, and I didn't care. They had no power over me anymore. I returned to my life, to surgeries, to nights without sleep, to patients who thanked me through tears. I saved another heart the day after he was discharged, an elderly woman who hugged me, calling me an angel. I smiled, but thought about him, how he didn't say it, how he couldn't. And I realized that I didn't need his words. I proved everything I wanted, not to them, but to myself. Those $43, that bus, those nights in the shelter, they brought me here, to a place where I was stronger than they could have ever imagined. But the silence was not peace. I stood on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the lights of Chicago, and felt the questions swirling in my head. Was it worth it, 10 years of struggle to save him and leave? Had I made a difference for them, or just for myself? I didn't know. I was holding a jar with $43, and it was as light as a feather, but as heavy as a stone. I had won, but it was a bitter victory, not because of him, but because I could still feel his shadow in me. I stepped into the silence, leaving him behind. He knew who I was, he knew what I had become, but I didn't give him the right to say anything. And when I went to bed that night, I felt hope, not for us, not for reconciliation, but for me. I went on, holding my head high, but with a question that had no answer: did he understand? Will I ever understand myself?